I got revenge on my friend for flirting with my husband. Revenge backfires. My most trusted friend dedicated months to luring my husband, believing he needed to explore other options. Now, she's certainly regretting crossing me. Cassie had been my closest confidant since our days sharing a dorm in nursing school. She was a fixture at every significant event in my life, even serving as my maid of honor when I married Dan 3 years prior. We were inseparable, enjoying countless weekend brunches, wine evenings, and double dates when she found a partner, which wasn't often, as her judgment in men was notoriously poor. Dan always expressed his happiness that I had such a supportive friend, frequently cooking extra portions when she visited, knowing her diet often consisted of takeout. Our lives felt perfect until approximately half a year ago, when Cassie ended her latest disastrous relationship with a boyfriend who had been secretly involved with his ex throughout their time together. I was there for her, as always, bringing ice cream and offering my couch for weeks of tearful solace. Dan, too, offered comfort, reassuring her she deserved better and including her in our plans so she wouldn't feel isolated. That's precisely when I began to sense a shift, a strangeness in her behavior. Cassie started sending texts directly to Dan, bypassing our usual group chat. Initially, it was just humorous images, then queries seeking his male perspective on potential dates from dating applications. Dan showed me every message, finding her requests amusing from a man's viewpoint. However, a creeping discomfort settled over me when these texts began arriving late at night. Then came the physical contact. Cassie would playfully grip Dan's arm when he made a joke, place her hand on his shoulder during conversations, and her hugs lingered noticeably longer than normal. At our game night, she chose the seat beside him instead of me, consistently leaning into his personal space. When I later brought it up, she dismissed my concerns, claiming I was being overly suspicious and that she felt like he was a brother to her. Yet, brothers don't typically notice when you switch to push-up bras and plunging necklines, do they? Her wardrobe choices rapidly became absurd. Cassie began to dress as if heading to a nightclub whenever she came over, tiny skirts, crop tops, full makeup for Sunday football. She'd deliberately bend over directly in front of Dan to retrieve things she'd clearly dropped on purpose. She even started wearing my signature perfume and bought an identical dress to the one I wore on our anniversary. Dan noticed and privately confided that he was growing uneasy. The ultimate breaking point arrived during my birthday dinner. Cassie appeared in a dress so short she couldn't sit without exposing herself to everyone, and she spent the entire evening attempting to feed Dan bits of her dessert. She continually referenced inside jokes from her texts with him and actually sat on his lap for photos, insisting it was all in good fun. When Dan pushed her away, she acted as if he were being overly sensitive. That night, I confronted her directly, stating her behavior toward Dan was inappropriate and needed to cease. She just laughed, calling me insecure, and suggested that perhaps if I were more entertaining, Dan wouldn't enjoy conversing with her so much. She actually said Dan probably appreciated having a friend who wasn't so dull and rigid. Then she dropped the bombshell. Married men, she claimed, needed female friends to remind them of other possibilities. I wanted to strike her, but instead, I opted for a more ingenious approach. First, I started involving my other friend, Rachel, in everything. Rachel was single, stunning, and genuinely respectful. Anytime Cassie messaged about getting together, I'd extend an invitation to Rachel as well. Cassie disliked not being the sole single friend, and Rachel naturally garnered all the attention Cassie was accustomed to. Dan and I would lavish praise on Rachel constantly, her career, her apartment, her dating anecdotes, while Cassie seethed in silence. Then I offered to help Cassie with her dating apps, but with a few strategic modifications. I encouraged her to connect with every man who showed interest and arrange multiple dates each week. I'd assist her in getting ready and boost her confidence, then text, requesting updates every 30 minutes during the dates. If she didn't reply immediately, I'd call the restaurant, feigning concern for her well-being. The men invariably assumed she had a possessive friend and usually cut the dates short. But the true masterpiece of my plan was introducing Cassie to Dan's colleague Luke. Luke was handsome, successful, and excessively clingy with women. I informed Luke that Cassie thrived on attention and had mentioned she found possessive men romantic. To Cassie, I painted Luke as shy, someone who needed to be actively pursued. Their initial date stretched to 6 hours because Luke refused to let her leave, declaring it a profound connection. Within a week, Luke was bombarding Cassie with hundreds of texts daily and appearing at her workplace with flowers. She tried to complain to me, but I gushed about how romantic his obsession was. And didn't she want someone who made her a priority? She found herself unable to break up with him without appearing heartless, having seemingly led him on. While Cassie wrestled with Luke, I made certain she was acutely aware of how wonderful my marriage was. I began documenting my life with Dan incessantly on social media. Every date night was meticulously recorded with smiling photos over dinner. Every private joke became a public caption. Every thoughtful gesture he performed for me was broadcast where Cassie was guaranteed to see it. I knew she checked my posts because the view count spiked within minutes, but her comments dwindled until they vanished completely. Dan found it odd how much I was suddenly sharing online, given I'd never been that type before. But I simply told him I wanted to cherish our happy moments. What I truly desired was for Cassie to see precisely what she couldn't have, while Luke sent his 200th text of the day, asking what she was doing and if she missed him. The silence from her end felt more satisfying than any reply. My phone vibrated around 9 on a Wednesday night, Cassie's name illuminating the screen. The message stated Luke had arrived at her apartment unexpectedly, carrying bags of groceries and cooking utensils because he wanted to prepare her a romantic meal. She wrote that she didn't know how to make him leave without appearing ungrateful, given his effort, and desperately sought my advice on what to say. I smirked at my phone and typed back that it sounded incredibly romantic and devoted, remarking that most women would yearn for a man who prioritized them in such a way, and she should truly appreciate someone who cared enough to surprise her like this. I added that perhaps she simply wasn't accustomed to genuine affection after all her troubled relationships. She sent 3 dots, indicating she was typing. Then they disappeared, and I heard nothing further from her that night. Dan entered the living room and discovered me refreshing Cassie's Instagram for the 5th time in 10 minutes. He paused in the doorway, staring for an extended moment before asking what I was doing. I quickly shut off my phone and claimed I was just checking on my friend to ensure she was all right. His expression remained unreadable, skeptical in a way that twisted my stomach. He offered no further words, merely shaking his head slightly before returning to the kitchen. Yet, I could feel his disappointment lingering in the air, heavy like smoke. I rationalized to myself that he couldn't comprehend what Cassie had attempted to do to us. But the image of his face haunted me for hours. 2 weeks into the Luke situation, Cassie finally tried to extricate herself. She messaged me that morning, announcing her intention to break up with him at lunch because things were progressing too rapidly and she needed personal space. I responded with a thumbs-up emoji and continued my day at the hospital. Around 2 in the afternoon, my phone exploded with messages from Cassie explaining Luke had appeared at her workplace instead of their agreed-upon restaurant, openly weeping in the lobby, proclaiming she was the sole good thing in his existence. She said her colleagues witnessed the entire spectacle, making her feel like a terrible person. The subsequent text revealed she'd agreed to give him another chance because he'd caused such a scene, and she couldn't simply discard him in front of everyone. I reread the messages twice, a warm sensation of satisfaction spreading through my chest. I planned a game night for that Saturday and invited everyone except Cassie. Rachel arrived with her new boyfriend. Dan's coworker brought his wife, and we set up board games and snacks, just like old times. I made sure to capture many photos of everyone laughing and enjoying themselves, posting them throughout the night with captions praising my wonderful friends. Rachel discreetly pulled me aside in the kitchen, suggesting it felt unkind to exclude Cassie when she was clearly struggling. I informed Rachel that Cassie was too preoccupied with Luke anyway. Besides, she had made her choices when she decided to disrespect my marriage. Rachel looked uneasy but didn't press the matter further. Cassie texted me on Monday morning, stating Luke had begun driving her to and from work, ensuring they spent more time together. She said she could no longer invent excuses about being tired or needing to run errands, because he was consistently waiting in the parking lot every single day. Her message concluded with the words that she felt she couldn't breathe. I waited an hour before replying, then sent a lengthy text about how relationships demand compromise, and perhaps she simply wasn't accustomed to someone so attentive after all her unreliable ex-partners. I wrote that she should endeavor to appreciate having someone who genuinely desired to be around her instead of pushing away something good. She left me on read. Dan's best friend, Boyd, visited on Thursday evening for beer and sports. They conversed in the living room while I showered, and I overheard their voices through the bathroom door once the water stopped. Boyd inquired if everything was all right with me, noting I seemed altered recently, more concerned with others' difficulties than my own existence. Dan's voice grew hushed and serious as he confessed his worry about my growing obsession with the entire Cassie situation. He stated I wasn't behaving like myself, and he wasn't sure how to raise the topic without instigating an argument. I stood frozen, towel-clad, listening to my husband reveal to his closest friend his concern about the person I was becoming. Friday afternoon, Cassie telephoned me instead of texting. Her voice was trembling and choked with tears as she recounted Luke's actions from the previous night. He had gone through her phone and became upset about her having male coworkers' numbers saved. She said he had demanded why she needed to communicate with other men when she had him, and he'd forced her to explain every single contact on her device. I could detect the underlying fear in her words, the way she was asking me if this was typical relationship behavior, or if she should be genuinely worried. Part of me knew I should urge her to flee, but another part vividly recalled her sitting on Dan's lap at my birthday celebration. I told her Luke was probably just insecure due to past relationships, and she should exercise patience with him as he learned to trust her. She thanked me softly and ended the call. I felt a sense of vindication. My coworker, Fairchild, intercepted me in the break room on Monday and mentioned seeing Dan and me at that Italian eatery downtown on Saturday night. She asked if it was strange encountering Cassie and Luke there, as they had been seated just a few tables away. My face flushed with heat as I realized Dan had certainly noticed where we were dining. He had probably deduced I'd specifically chosen that restaurant because I knew Cassie and Luke would be there. Fairchild continued to chatter about how charming Dan and I appeared together compared to the apparent tension at Cassie's table, and I mumbled something about needing to return to work. Dan said nothing about it that evening, but he observed me differently, as if trying to decipher my true self. 3 weeks into Cassie's relationship with Luke, she texted me a screenshot of a message from him declaring his love for her. She wrote that when she didn't immediately reciprocate, he had become profoundly quiet and odd for several days. She questioned if she was being unreasonable for not feeling the same way yet, if something was inherently wrong with her for not knowing after such a brief period. I could have explained that 3 weeks was far too soon, and his reaction was manipulative. But instead, I typed back that some individuals simply connect faster than others, and perhaps she should consider why she was so afraid of commitment. I added that after all her failed relationships, maybe her instincts regarding love weren't entirely dependable anyway. She didn't respond for hours, and when she finally did, it was merely a simple okay. That Tuesday night, Dan prepared spaghetti with his homemade sauce, and we ate at the kitchen table as usual. He inquired about my shift at the hospital, and I recounted the story of the patient in room 304 who kept removing his 4. We cleared the dishes together, and I was rinsing plates when Dan turned off the water and stood there, gazing at me. He stated we needed to discuss Cassie and my recent actions. A cold dread settled in my stomach, but I maintained a neutral expression and claimed ignorance of his meaning. Dan's jaw hardened, and he said he'd been observing me for weeks now, watching me constantly post about us, watching me check my phone every 5 minutes to see if Cassie had replied, watching me orchestrate situations specifically to make her feel bad. He emphasized that this wasn't characteristic of me, and he was uncomfortable with the extent of my actions. I set down the plate and turned to face him fully, a surge of heat rising in my chest. I told him Cassie deserved everything she was experiencing after what she'd attempted to do to our marriage, after she sat on his lap at my birthday dinner and declared that married men needed to be reminded of other possibilities. Dan's expression remained unchanged. He then stated that her actions didn't justify me transforming into someone who deliberately inflicted pain on others. He said that when he married me, he married a person who was kind and authentic, not someone who manipulated circumstances to cause distress. The way he looked at me sent a chill through my core, because I could see him perceiving a stranger standing in our kitchen. I didn't text Cassie for 2 days following that, and she didn't text me either. On Wednesday, I sent her a humorous meme about difficult hospital patients, and she left me on read. Thursday morning, I sent her a photo of a dress I was considering buying and solicited her opinion. The read receipt showed she'd seen it, but no response came through. By Thursday night, I was checking my phone every 10 minutes, scrolling back through our message history to see if I'd overlooked something. This wasn't how it was supposed to unfold. She was meant to be miserable and reaching out to me, not completely ignoring me. Friday afternoon, my phone finally buzzed with her name, and I snatched it so quickly I nearly dropped it. Her message stated Luke demanded much of her attention currently, and she'd catch up with me later, perhaps sometime next week. I stared at those words, feeling panic instead of triumph, because I was losing control of the entire situation. Saturday morning, I drove to Cassie's apartment without phoning ahead. I knocked 3 times before she opened the door, and when she did, I scarcely recognized her. She had shed weight and bore dark circles beneath her eyes, her hair haphazardly tied back in a messy bun. She appeared startled to see me but stepped aside to grant me entry. Luke occupied her couch, his arm draped across the back cushions as if he owned the place. He glanced at me but offered neither a smile nor a greeting, simply redirecting his attention to the television. Cassie motioned toward the other chair, and I sat down, trying to meet her gaze. I asked how she was, and she began to speak, but Luke interjected, declaring they were wonderful, spending ample quality time together. Cassie's smile seemed forced, and I observed how she kept her body subtly angled toward Luke, as if monitoring his reactions. I attempted to ask about her work, and Luke again interrupted to say she'd been exceedingly busy lately. That, he implied, was why she hadn't been responding to people. The way he uttered people made it unequivocally clear he meant me specifically. Each time Cassie began to articulate a thought, Luke would append something, correct her, or complete her sentence. I watched this pattern repeat 4 times within 10 minutes and realized the monstrosity I had unleashed was far more dreadful than I had intended. Cassie rose and offered me water. I accepted, despite not being thirsty, because I wanted to ascertain if she would go to the kitchen alone. She did, and Luke immediately rose to follow her. I overheard their voices from the other room, Luke's tone tight and controlled. He was inquiring about my identity and my true reason for being there. Cassie's voice sounded anxious as she explained I was her best friend from nursing school. Luke asserted he believed he was her best friend now. The way he spoke those words sent shivers down my spine because they conveyed possessiveness, not genuine affection. Cassie attempted to laugh it off, suggesting people could have multiple friends, but Luke persisted, asking why she needed other friends when she had him. I heard her mention something about female friendships being distinct, and Luke fell silent in a manner that felt menacing. They re-entered the living room, and Cassie handed me the water with trembling hands. I remained for another 15 minutes, observing Luke touch her arm, her shoulder, and her knee, watching her subtly flinch each time, yet maintaining a forced smile. When I announced my departure, Luke neither rose nor bid me farewell. He simply kept his eyes on the TV as if I had ceased to exist. I sat in my car in Cassie's parking lot for 20 minutes, hands gripping the steering wheel. My heart pounded, and I felt genuinely afraid for her safety, rather than smugly satisfied with my revenge. Luke's conduct had escalated from merely annoying to dangerously controlling. And I had set this entire chain of events in motion by telling him Cassie appreciated possessive men. I had painted a target on her back and provided him with the ammunition. The way he had followed her into the kitchen. The way he had monitored her every utterance. The way he had spoken of being her best friend as if replacing everyone else in her life. This was no longer mere clinginess. This was perilous. I started my car and drove home, my stomach churning, because I had wanted Cassie to suffer. But not like this. Not with someone who might actually harm her. Dan was engrossed in a book in bed when I arrived home around midnight. I stood in the doorway, gazing at my phone screen displaying Cassie's last message. Dan lowered his book and inquired what was wrong. The words tumbled out before I could suppress them. I confessed I had manipulated Luke into pursuing Cassie by telling him she found possessive men appealing. I admitted I had encouraged Cassie to engage with Luke, portraying him as shy. I revealed I had orchestrated the entire scenario as an act of retribution. And now I was terrified Luke might actually pose a threat. Dan's face transitioned through 3 distinct expressions. First, shock, his eyes widening. Then, disappointment, his mouth drooping at the corners. Finally, anger, his jaw clenching tightly. He remained silent for a prolonged moment, then rose and walked past me into the hallway. I heard the guest room door close and the lock engage. Morning light filtered through the bedroom window, and I had not slept a wink. I found Dan in the kitchen, preparing coffee, and he avoided my gaze when I entered. I poured myself a cup and waited. He finally spoke, asserting I needed to rectify my actions before someone was hurt. He confessed he wasn't certain he could view me the same way after learning the depths to which I had taken this retaliation. His words inflicted a deeper wound than anything Cassie had ever said, because Dan's opinion was the only one that truly mattered to me. He declared the woman he married would never have intentionally put someone in harm's way, regardless of their transgressions. He questioned when I had transformed into a person who caused injury instead of preventing it. I attempted to explain I simply wanted Cassie to experience discomfort, to grasp what it was like to contend with unwelcome attention, but Dan shook his head. He argued that intentions were irrelevant when the outcome was someone trapped with a controlling individual. He departed for work without his customary goodbye kiss. I dialed Luke's workplace HR department from my cell phone, blocking my number. A woman answered, introducing herself as Laura Fairchild, and asked how she could assist. I outlined concerning behavioral patterns without using Cassie's name. I stated an employee had been exhibiting obsessive conduct toward a dating partner, repeatedly appearing at their workplace, sending hundreds of texts daily, following them into other rooms. Laura requested the employee's name, and I provided Luke's full name and department. She assured me they would investigate and inquired if I wished to leave my contact information. I declined and ended the call. I knew this wouldn't be enough to truly separate them, as their dating occurred outside work, and HR couldn't regulate their personal lives. Quote, revenge is a bitter meal. My phone buzzed Tuesday afternoon with a photograph from Cassie. The image depicted a massive floral arrangement on her desk at work. Roses, lilies, and orchids elegantly presented in an expensive vase. The card was visible in the photo and read, "I can't imagine life without you," in Luke's handwriting. Below the picture, Cassie had typed that she was now afraid to end their relationship. I gazed at those words, feeling the full weight of my deeds. This was no longer mere inconvenience. This was genuine fear. I had desired revenge and achieved it. But the price was watching my closest friend since nursing school become entangled with someone I had deliberately directed toward her. Thursday morning, I texted Cassie, requesting to meet for coffee without Luke's knowledge. She agreed, and we met at our usual spot near the hospital, where we often went after shifts. She looked even more exhausted than she had on Saturday, and her hands trembled slightly as she lifted her cup. I directly asked her about her situation with Luke. She stared into her coffee and confessed she had been trying to end things for weeks, but he consistently persuaded her otherwise or made her feel guilty. She explained that each time she brought up breaking up, he would weep and claim she was the only positive thing in his existence. She said he had begun discussing moving in together and meeting each other's families, and she didn't know how to make it stop. She looked at me with desperate eyes and asked how she had ended up in this predicament, how she had become trapped with someone after only a few weeks of dating. I longed to tell her the truth about my involvement, but the words caught in my throat, because vocalizing them would mean acknowledging what I had become. I sat there, paralyzed, unable to articulate the words that would reveal how I had intentionally ruined her life. Dan returned home from work that evening and found me still at the kitchen table, staring at my phone. He asked what was amiss, and I showed him Cassie's text about her fear of Luke. His face hardened in a way I had never witnessed before, and he sat down opposite me. "We need to fix this immediately," he declared. "Not tomorrow or next week, but tonight." He retrieved his laptop and began searching for resources about leaving controlling relationships. While I sat there feeling like the most dreadful person alive, we discovered websites detailing safety planning and organizations that assisted individuals in escaping unhealthy situations. Dan compiled a list of steps Cassie would need to undertake and asked me to call her right then. I dialed her number with trembling hands and asked if she could come over without disclosing her destination to Luke. She arrived 20 minutes later, glancing over her shoulder as she walked up our driveway. Dan prepared coffee while I struggled to formulate how to initiate this conversation. Cassie sat on our couch, picking at her fingernails, and said Luke had been texting her every 5 minutes, asking her whereabouts. Dan brought the coffee and sat in the chair across from us, not beside me as he usually did. I took a deep breath and told Cassie I needed to confess something terrible. The words spilled out in a torrent about how I had intentionally paired her with Luke. How I had informed him she preferred possessive men, how I had encouraged her to pursue him when he was, in fact, dangerous. Her face displayed such a rapid succession of emotions I couldn't track them all. Confusion first, then comprehension, then an expression of complete betrayal that made me wish to vanish. She inquired why I would do that to her after everything we had shared. I admitted I sought revenge for her actions with Dan, for the touching, the texting, and her sitting on his lap. She leaned back against the couch cushions and laughed, a bitter, hollow sound that wasn't truly laughter. "At least now," she remarked, "I know we are both capable of harming each other." There was an almost relieved tone in her voice, as if she had been anticipating me to prove I was just as flawed. Dan cleared his throat and stated we could address blame later, but for now, we needed to safely extricate Cassie from Luke. He showed her the resources we had found and explained that ending a relationship with someone like Luke demanded a well-thought-out strategy. Cassie looked at the laptop screen and began to weep, genuine tears that streaked her mascara down her cheeks. She explained she didn't know how to escape because Luke always knew her location and activities. Dan proposed we contact a therapist specializing in helping individuals leave controlling relationships. He had found someone named Miriam Hole, who had excellent reviews and expertise in this precise situation. Cassie agreed to call her the following morning, and Dan offered to accompany her to the first appointment if she wished. I felt like an observer in my own living room, watching my husband embody the person I should have been. The next day, Cassie met with Miriam and returned to our house afterward to inform us of the outcome. Miriam had immediately taken her seriously and commenced work on a safety plan. She would meet with Cassie twice a week and help her prepare for the breakup. The plan involved having people present during the confrontation, blocking all of Luke's contact information immediately afterward, and meticulously documenting everything in case a restraining order became necessary. Cassie appeared frightened, yet also determined, in a way I hadn't seen since our nursing school days when we studied for our licensing exams together. Over the subsequent 2 weeks, Miriam assisted Cassie in rehearsing what she would say and preparing for Luke's probable reactions. Dan and I agreed to occupy a nearby table during the breakup for safety. Cassie selected a bustling downtown restaurant where numerous witnesses would be present. The night arrived more swiftly than I wished. We got there early and settled at a table from which we could observe Cassie's booth without being conspicuous. Luke arrived first, and I watched him repeatedly check his phone while he waited. Cassie walked in 10 minutes later, and I could see her hands trembling from across the restaurant. They ordered drinks, and Cassie began speaking. I couldn't discern the words, but I witnessed Luke's face shift from confusion to upset to anger. His voice grew louder, and patrons at nearby tables began to glance over. Cassie rose to depart, and Luke seized her wrist. Dan was out of his seat before I could even react. He walked over and instructed Luke to release Cassie's arm. Luke let go, but then erupted into loud sobs that drew everyone's attention. He was uttering statements about how Cassie was his entire existence, and he couldn't survive without her. The restaurant manager approached and inquired if everything was satisfactory. Cassie stated she was leaving and Luke needed to keep his distance. Luke attempted to follow her out, and the manager obstructed his path while summoning other staff members. They ultimately had to physically escort Luke out through the kitchen entrance while he yelled Cassie's name. We brought Cassie back to our house, where she sat on the couch, shaking and crying. She had done it, but she looked shattered by the ordeal. The next morning, Luke started texting from various numbers. Cassie blocked each one as it appeared, but they kept coming. He sent emails, attempted to contact her through social media, and even created fake accounts to circumvent her blocks. Miriam advised her to save everything and document every single attempt at contact. Luke appeared at Cassie's workplace 3 days later with flowers and a letter. Her boss had to threaten to involve the authorities before he finally departed. Miriam assisted Cassie in filing for a restraining order, and we accompanied her to the courthouse. The legal process spanned weeks of paperwork and waiting for court dates. Luke contested the order, and Cassie had to stand before a judge and articulate why she feared him. She presented all the texts, emails, and documented visits. The judge granted the temporary order and set a hearing date for the permanent one. Luke violated the order twice before the hearing. Once by appearing at Cassie's apartment building and once by sending a letter via a mutual acquaintance. Each violation was added to the case file. The day of the final hearing arrived, and Cassie was so anxious she vomited in the courthouse restroom. Dan and I sat behind her in the courtroom while she testified about Luke's behavior. Luke's lawyer tried to paint a picture of her having led him on, and then capriciously changing her mind. The judge interrupted him, stating the evidence was undeniable. The permanent restraining order was approved. Cassie exited the courthouse and began to cry again, but this time, from sheer relief. 2 months elapsed before Cassie and I met for coffee at our usual spot near the hospital where we used to unwind after shifts. We sat facing each other, both of us seeming hesitant with our words. She inquired about my relationship with Dan, and I replied we were actively working on it. I asked about her therapy progress, and she said Miriam was helping her understand why she had been susceptible to Luke's influence initially. The conversation felt strained and uncomfortable, as if we were strangers attempting politeness. Cassie finally voiced that she wasn't sure if we could maintain our friendship as it once was. I agreed, suggesting that perhaps we could develop a different kind of connection eventually, but we both required time. She nodded, and we sat in silence for a while. Before she left, she apologized for her actions concerning Dan and expressed understanding for my anger. I confessed my remorse for setting her up with Luke and stated I would never forgive myself for endangering her. We shared a brief embrace, and it felt like bidding farewell to a person I used to know. Quote, "Some bonds break, leaving only echoes." Dan and I commenced couples therapy the following week. Our therapist asked us both why we were there, and I had to acknowledge my actions toward Cassie. Dan informed the therapist he was grappling with reconciling the person he loved with someone who could deliberately inflict harm. The therapist helped us delve into what my retaliation had revealed about my character. Dan said he had always envisioned me as someone who aided others, given my profession as a nurse. That's what nurses do, after all. In this shocking story from Reddit Gossip Daily, hear how my best friend, Cassie, crossed the line by relentlessly pursuing my husband, Dan. When her advances escalated from uncomfortable texts to inappropriate physical contact, I knew I had to act. Instead of confronting her directly, I devised an intricate plan for revenge, manipulating her dating life and introducing her to a possessive new man, Luke. My scheme worked, but the consequences were far more severe than I anticipated, trapping Cassie in a dangerous situation. This tale explores the dark side of betrayal, the slippery slope of revenge, and the irreparable damage it caused to my marriage and friendships. Was my revenge justified, or did I become the very person I despised? Join Reddit Gossip Daily for this raw, emotional journey. Chapters: 0:00 a.m. Deceptive Friendship. 2:30 The scheme begins. 5:00 My twisted masterpiece. 7:15 The price of vengeance. 9:45 An unrecognizable reflection. Shareable quotes. Revenge is a bitter meal. Some bonds break, leaving only echoes. Pinned comment. After hearing this story, do you think revenge is ever truly worth the emotional cost? Let us know in the comments. Discovering I possessed manipulative and cruel tendencies had fundamentally shaken his perception of me. I attempted to explain I had felt deeply betrayed and wanted Cassie to experience the same pain she had caused me. The therapist asked if seeking revenge had brought me any solace. I admitted it hadn't, and in fact, I felt worse than before. We attended therapy weekly, and slowly, Dan began to trust me again, but it wasn't the effortless trust we had previously shared. 6 months later, Cassie and I exchanged occasional texts about trivial matters like work and the weather. We met for coffee every few weeks and confined our conversations to safe subjects. We were both profoundly different people than we had been a year ago. She was more cautious about whom she placed her trust in, and I was more acutely aware of my own capabilities when I felt threatened. Dan and I were painstakingly rebuilding our marriage through therapy, but sometimes I caught him observing me with unspoken questions in his eyes that hadn't been there before. He would inquire if I truly meant something I had said or if I was subtly trying to manipulate him. Each time he asked, it felt like a fresh wound because I knew I had earned his doubt. I had sought vengeance on Cassie for attempting to claim what was mine, and I had achieved it. She had been trapped with a dangerous individual, scared and remorseful for her actions. But the triumph didn't feel like winning. It felt as though I had proven I was precisely the kind of person I had been furious at her for being. Someone who would harm their friend to obtain what they desired. Someone who prioritized being correct over being good. I had protected my marriage but irrevocably damaged it in the process because Dan now understood what I was capable of when I felt betrayed. Cassie and I would likely never again be close friends. And that was a loss I would have to endure. I got my revenge and demonstrated she couldn't take my husband. But the ultimate cost was becoming someone unrecognizable when I gazed into the mirror.